All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chapter 5 lecture. This is going to be on an introduction to criminological theory. Sometimes theory isn't covered in intro classes, however, seeing as we are a criminology program, that's something that we went over in previous chapters. We are a criminology program, so we do study criminology, so we have to cover criminological theory. You're going to realize that theory is one of the bases that we base all of our research on in some sort of way. And today we're going to cover what I believe are the main components of criminological theory, and the main theories that are out there that you're going to be exposed to on a regular basis throughout your coursework, and hopefully into the future. Because, in my opinion, every good criminal justice piece of work or literature is based around solid theory. So let's move on. So, learning objectives. Obviously, learning objectives are important. Like I already said, how do I know if you learned the learning objectives? I test you on them. So, once again, if you're looking for a good place to start when it comes to developing a study guide for an exam, and yes, we do have an exam coming up relatively soon, I would recommend starting here. So there's learning objectives on the second slide as well as on the third slide. Make sure that you know how to at least attempt to address these questions, and that'll be a good place to start studying for your exam. So, effort to explain criminal behavior, whether by explaining crime patterns or using criminological theories, are useful for a reason. So we can explain how crime helps to prevent, explaining crime helps to prevent crime. So if you know how to explain how crime happens, then we can kind of cut out the middleman and take away whatever opportunity structure or negative sociological aspect that is causing crime. We can take that away or improve it, and hopefully we can stop crime that way. Crime explanations are also useful in that they help criminologists to understand their research findings. Crime explanations guide criminal justice research projects. Like I said, all good research and all good policy is based on theory somehow in some way. And we do test specific theories. For example, routine activities theories and opportunity theory are two criminological theories that I study a lot. I work based on opportunity structures and the way that those facilitate criminal activity, and basically how taking away those opportunity structures don't allow criminal activity to happen. So that's one of the ways of a real life explanation as to how we can use these criminological theories to basically understand what's going on with our research findings. Beliefs about the causes of the crime influence individual behaviors in the criminal justice system as well. So, theoretical frameworks can be characterized as a crime is a product of one of 5 different things. So, crime is a result of one of these 5 different things, essentially, is what this slide is saying. So, it is a result of choice. So, criminals choose to commit crimes. Biological factors, essentially saying that they're predestined to commit crimes. Social factors, which is socioeconomic status, demographics, stuff like that. Social psychological factors, and then cognitive processes. So we're going to kind of touch on these different 5 aspects throughout this lecture, but these are kind of the 5 main categories, I guess you could say, of criminological theory. So crime is a product of choice. So some theories explain the crime by focusing on decision making on the part of offenders, right? So basically they are choosing in some way or another to commit said crime. So the main 2 theories that cover this, crime is a product of choice, is deterrence or rational choice theory and routine activities theory. So let's go ahead and in depth to those 2. Deterrence or rational choice theory. Deterrence theory is traced to Cesar Beccaria. He is one of the godfathers, I guess you could say, of criminological theory. I would recommend knowing some of the names that are going to pop up in these PowerPoints, just so that you know. It is very, very, very useful to identify who has proposed the theory. You're going to see that that's going to come across basically every single theory that I'm going to cover in this lecture. Knowing who proposed it, when it was proposed, is very, very important in understanding more into criminological theory. So, as previously mentioned, it's traced all the way back to Cesar Beccaria. According to Beccaria, in order for punishment to be effective, it must meet 3 criteria. It must be swift, must be certain, and it must outweigh the pleasure that the offender would get from committing the crime. Okay, so it's also important to know Beccaria was not actually a criminologist. Okay, he was simply a social activist back in the day who was protesting the fact that the punishments that people were receiving, people had no idea what the punishment were for crime. He simply proposed that these punishments should be made public knowledge. And if they were made public knowledge, people would be able to, and if you pay attention to that kind of third aspect, the third criteria, they'd be able to weigh the pleasure versus the pain. So it's kind of human nature, and there's a lot of different studies that you can look into at a different time. But the basics of it is human nature. We are going to do whatever we can to experience pleasure and not experience pain. It is the selfish human aspect that basically all humans attempt to do. So Beccaria, without formally saying that, just kind of recognized the fact that, people steal because they don't know what the punishment is for stealing. If we told them that, and yes, this was way back in the day when people were still using the very old school methods of punishments, and sometimes stealing, you would get your hand cut off for stealing. If people knew, for example, what was going to happen if they were caught stealing, then that is going to deter, in essence, why deterrence theory is what that frame of reference is referencing. It is going to deter people from committing said crime. So the punishment, when it comes to these 3 different criteria, so the punishment must be swift. The main reason that it needs to be swift is so that the offender can associate the punishment with the crime that they cause. So if you think about it, if I committed a crime and the next day I was punished for it in some sort of way, right, it would be easy for me to psychologically associate said punishment with the crime, if that makes sense. Maybe another way to think of it is on the other end of the spectrum. If, say, I commit a crime today and I'm not punished for it for another 10 years, it's going to be hard for me to associate that punishment with a crime, and it's not going to have as much of a deterrence effect. Okay? And like we said, these 3 criteria for the punishment to be effective, and deter the individual from committing the crime. Okay? So certainty is the fact that I'm going to get punished. So this kind of falls onto the fact that our criminal justice system is effective as a whole. The certainty of being punished, the fact that police are going to come, they're going to investigate, they're going to find out that it was me, and they were going to find me and bring me to justice. That is what certainty refers to. And the fact that it is slightly worse in terms of the pleasure that the criminal would gain for committing the crime. So kind of the best way to think about this is, say, for example, if I stole $20, then my sentence is going to be that I owe that $20 back plus another 5, right? It's going to be slightly worse. And because like I said previously, we as humans are going to weigh pleasure versus pain. We are always going to try and seek pleasure rather than pain, and avoid pain at all costs. So if we know that if I get caught stealing this $20 and I'm going to owe 30 back, then that slightly outweighs in terms of pain the pleasure that I would possibly experience from committing that crime. So that is what is going to look at as slightly outweighing the pain versus the pleasure. If that doesn't make much sense, that's something that we can discuss more in the open discussion forum. I apologize for this all being online, but that's kind of the best I can do. One of the main aspects of deterrence theory is that there are 2 different types of deterrence. There is specific, and then there is general deterrence. The best way that I can kind of discuss this, and the best way that you can comprehend it, is when you're thinking about who is being deterred from committing the crime. So in order for it to be specific deterrence is when it comes to the individual that has already committed a crime, okay? So obviously deterrence theory is all based on punishments, right? So we can't deter somebody without having punishments. Basically, specific deterrence is when, say, I would commit a crime, say I committed that theft of $20 like I was just talking about. You want my punishment to be effective enough that you are specifically deterring me from committing the crime again, okay? And keyword is again. So specific deterrence is an individual that has already committed a crime, and you are going to stop him or her from committing the crime again. General deterrence, on the other hand, I like to think of as the general population. So general deterrence is when we have a public criminal justice system and that these punishments are going to somehow work their way through the line. General deterrence also applies to how Cesar Beccaria was saying that we should just publicly announce what these punishments would be. But deterrence for deterring the general public from committing a crime the first time. Okay, so specific is committing one individual is stopping one individual from committing a crime again. General deterrence is stopping the general population from committing a crime in the first place. So rational choice theory is also a type of deterrence theory. It posits that that for offenders, the decision to commit a crime served a specific purpose of the offender. It seems that behavior is always instrumental and purposeful. Okay, so rational choice theory, it states that criminals are all rational and think before they act. So seeing as they are rational, proper punishments, like in deterrence theory, hence why these are sometimes linked together, right? So if they are rational and they can commit rational thoughts, i.e. rational choice theory, then proper punishments being put in place can deter individuals from committing crime. So routine activities theory. Routine activities theory is also one of the theories that I really research a lot, and I put into my research. It was developed by Lawrence Cohen and Marcus Felsen in 1979. So it's relatively new. If you want to look at a timeline of criminological theory, you can kind of go and Google that. I'm not necessarily worried about dates more than where I'm worried about knowing who proposed it and the main proponents of it. But it was in 1979. It's fairly new. It is fairly new. So they suggested that crime occurs when three things occur at the same time and in the same location, right? So you have a motivated offender is present, capable guardians are absent, and vulnerable targets are present. Okay, so essentially what they get into is the crime triangle. So this crime triangle is derived from routine activities theory, and it is the three different aspects of routine activities theory. So when these three things come together, right there in the middle, you'll see highlighted in that red and maroonish color is crime. So when we have a motivated offender, so Johnny's ready to steal. Okay, we'll just talk about theft. It's kind of an easy crime to discuss, especially when it comes to routine activities theory. So we have a motivated offender. So Johnny needs money, or say he needs cigarettes. Everybody that smokes cigarettes addicted to cigarettes. So let's say that he needs cigarettes. So suitable target, right? A target can be a person or it can be a place. So essentially in this example, we're not going to steal from a person. We're going to go ahead and just steal from the store. So the target would be the store itself. The fact that it is suitable is because, say there's only one person working and he or she is back trying to stock the shelves because nobody's in the store. And Johnny knows this. So that makes it suitable, okay? And the absence of a capable guardian is the fact that capable guardian, the guardian of the store, is supposed to be the person that is working. If you want to think of it when it comes to juvenile crime, the absence of a capable guardian is, he or she's mom or dad is not around and they're not there monitoring their child's behavior. But when we have all three of these things coming together, that is where, not always when crime occurs. It's not just when that happens. There's other reasons why crime might not occur, but the propensity for crime to occur goes through the roof, is essentially what Cohen and Felsen said. So that's routine activities theory in a nutshell. It's been very useful to explain societal crime trends. It's also been useful in promoting crime prevention strategies. The crime prevention, Clark and Eck are two last names of two researchers that they actually are British that use this to basically coin the term situational crime prevention. It's also led to lifestyles theory, so a theory that explains why victims are victimized rather than why offenders commit crimes. It's essentially lifestyles theory branched off of routine activities theory because the suitable targets, people walking through a middle-class neighborhood with tons of supervision and street cameras and other people walking around and this, that, and the next, they're not suitable targets. But suitable targets are, poor, lower class societies with a lack of guardianship, tangible goods, stuff like that, a lot of cash lying around. That's kind of what lifestyle theory is getting at. So crime is a part of biological factors. So this is a little bit more old school. We've kind of grown out of this, although there is still research being done on biological factors. The onset of biological theories, maybe I should think of it that way. The onset of biological theories are kind of old school, and you'll see kind of what we're talking about here sooner or later, that these kind of have been debunked at this time. But it's still important to know because this is kind of how different theories were derived. Once we disprove some of these biological theories, the way that we disproved them is that we proved other ones, or let's not use the word prove because that's not good to use when it comes to theory, but we can talk about how biological theories were not supported because other theories were supported at a higher rate and with better statistical significance. So they suggest that factors are related to an individual biological makeup contribute to crime. So Lombroso is the biggest the biggest kind of proponent, or the original proponent of biological factors. So he kind of referred to criminals as atavistic throwbacks, or the born criminal, basically saying that they are born criminal based upon their DNA. So if you have a mom and a dad that are both criminal, then their offspring are going to be criminal, essentially is what that is saying. William Sheldon did somatotyping, identified 3 different types of body types is what somatotyping is. Mesomorphs, endomorphs, and ectomorphs. Mesomorphs are extremely muscular individuals, so the big brawny guy that's, can put on muscle no matter what, that kind of thing, that are just big burly individuals, they're mesomorphs. Ectomorphs are slender and not muscular, so the toothpicks per se, or the string beans, the 6'6" friend that you have that can't weigh over 100 pounds. That's what an ectomorph is. And endomorphs are overweight. Sheldon found that mesomorphs are extremely muscular, and they also were the ones that were committing more crime. One of the reasons why he found this was because he researched in prisons where back in the day, one of the only things that prisoners had to do was to work out. So a large majority of people in prison, for self-protection and for entertainment purposes, either were mesomorphs to begin with or turned themselves into mesomorphs because that's either all they had to do, or they were trying to protect themselves essentially by putting on more muscle. So in case they got into a fight in prison, that's, they can almost try and hold their own. But that's what William Sheldon identified. So he identified mesomorphs as being criminals, but like I said, biological factors and biological theories have been not supported in modern research. That's kind of an example as to why. So crime is a product of social factors. So this is when it gets a lot more interesting. It gets a lot more modern, and it gets a lot more debated as well. One of the reasons why social factors and crime as a social factor is a highly debated topic is because of the measurements and strategies of measuring. For example, social disorganization theory is a theory I've worked with a lot. We are still trying to develop the best measurements of social disorganization theory. There's different factors that we know we should measure that lead to crime, but the way that we measure said factors is very, very, very highly debated topic. It's also an ever-changing topic. When more data becomes available, it's harder. It's constantly evolving is a good way to look at it. But these are kind of the 4 main theories that consider how social factors contribute to crime, and we're about to go over them. So social disorganization theory, this is Shaw and McKay. This is back in 1942, Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay. General premise is that communities vary in their ability to regulate residents or people who come into the community. Concentric zone theory is a theory that they applied, that basically they did this in Chicago. Concentric zone theory looked at the way the rings around Chicago, starting from the city center. And if you think about it, it still applies today. There is still statistical significance and research that supports this theory to this day. A lot of crime happens in the inner city. One of the things that is one of the characteristics of the inner city is that there is a big melting pot of people, which scholars kind of refer to as ethnic heterogeneity. There is low socioeconomic status because it's a lot of young people trying to get on their feet. It's also higher expenses to live in the inner city, which kind of hurts them and helps them all at the same time. And it's also a very transient population, meaning that people are moving in and out of the inner city at higher rates than they are in the suburbs. They're trying to move in to the inner city, get the money that they can to move out into the suburbs and work their way out from the inside out, if you think of it that way. Broken windows theory is kind of another thing that was derived from this. That was Wilson and Kelling. They wrote an article in the Atlantic, which is a newspaper and a journal. Um, Basically saying that small disorder crimes led to bigger issues. It was also embraced, broken windows theory, that is, was embraced in New York City until it led to discrimination lawsuits, on behalf of minorities. So basically what broken windows theory was these small disorder crimes are, one, given the impression that it is a high crime area to outsiders, and two, it is giving criminals the impression that there are basically there's no regulation in this area, so I can go and do whatever I want. So the policy implication of broken windows theory is to cut out small disorder crimes like graffiti, like small drug trafficking and small drug use, vandalism, that kind of stuff. Poverty, like this is kind of where being poor became criminalized, because homelessness was, they were trying to kick all the homeless people out of the neighborhoods so that they could say, like, it would give the impression that the neighborhood was regulated. Um, in doing these things, it would essentially give the neighborhood a nicer appearance and deter criminals from committing crime in those areas that way, because it would give criminals the impression that this is a very regulated area and this isn't the area that I should go and commit a crime in. Obviously, like I said, this was embraced in New York City until it led to a lot of lawsuits, because what they were doing was the the police department in essence was giving a lot of white people the okay to go ahead, and a lot of black people were getting patted down. This was also a time of Terry versus Ohio. You'll learn about that in your law class, but this was kind of all the same period of time. So subcultural theories, essentially this is saying that they indicate that anyone who is a part of a less dominant culture is automatically oppressed, because the dominant culture are those who have made the laws. And so if you think about it this way, the easiest way to talk about this is when it comes to race. Obviously, back in the day when America was established, the laws were made by white landowners. I mean, that's just a fact. So there was not much representation of any sort of minority or black community at that time. So you're not going to see those black ideals and black ways of life reflected in the laws that we have in America. So, through that establishment of the laws, you have oppressed the black community and you have allowed the white community to not have a sense of lawlessness, if you want to think of it that way. That's the main basic, or the best example I can give of a subcultural theory. This also applies just strictly to socioeconomic status when it comes to poor and rich. It comes to gender when it comes to male and female. You can apply that to all of these different different demographics essentially that I just covered. The middle class measuring rod, it refers to Cohen, which we just talked about a little bit ago. He also kind of coined this term. This is another just example of a subcultural theory. It's kind of embracing the fact that like poor and African American boys is what he was kind of referred to as, school age boys. That's when it comes to his book. That's where this middle class measuring rod was established. It was with young men. They're automatically frustrated when it comes to schooling because the standards are tailored to middle class white values. Even the most intelligent of African American, Black, or Latino or Asian boys in schools, they were frustrated because even the most intelligent ones were not holding up to par when it comes to the white middle class values, because they weren't even exposed to these values at home and they had no idea what they were asking of them, essentially. So that's kind of what it means when it comes to the middle class measuring rod. Cloward and Olin, they looked at a differential opportunity theory. Basically, the bottom line of this is that Black children are more likely to become drug dealers to live their lives of fame and riches. That's kind of how Cloward and Olin phrased it. That's what their study showed. Basically, differential opportunity theory states that white boys have different role models than Black boys do. White boys see, dad going to his, let's be exaggerative with it, to his Fortune 500, he's a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and bringing home hundreds of thousands of dollars. So their goal is to go and get a college education so that they can go be like dad. On the other spectrum of the same, and let's just be completely stereotypical and as astronomically stereotypical as possible, let's just say that African American boys, they live in these terrible neighborhoods and the only people that have a ton of money are drug dealers. You can say that there is a lot of relevance to that, and it's probably true in a lot of areas. And that's what Cloward and Nolan was getting to. If they wanted to make money and have fame and have a good life, then that's the way that they did it. If you want to tie it back to the middle class measuring rod, they're not going to make it in school because the white middle class values are what they're being graded on. So why would they go and try and test themselves against middle class values? They're just going to drop out of high school as soon as they can and try and start selling drugs and become a drug kingpin because that's who's making millions of dollars. That's the best way to do it. Elijah Anderson is also very, very famous for his book, Code of the Street. He's also written a couple other books if you're interested in reading about this. Code of the Street is probably a great place to start. You're also probably going to read it at some point in time throughout your criminal justice degree just because of how famous the text is. But Code of the Street, it kind of separated decent and street families. So Elijah Anderson did this. This was kind of like a seminal work of a lot of observational data that he had when he actually went to the streets and document. I believe it was Philadelphia. It was Philadelphia. I wanted to say Baltimore, but it was Philadelphia. Is where he went and did all this qualitative observational work and wrote about it. And he wrote about how there is a lot of different people, even within the Black community, they are looked at as decent and street families, and it's based upon their values and the culture that they adhere to. So decent families are, and this is applying to the African American community, decent families are African Americans who have somehow had some sort of legitimate success. And I mean legitimate based on, legal success, because street families are more prone to adhere to like some sort of street way of making money. And he refers to drugs a lot, and prostitution a lot, things like that. But decent families are ones that adhere to like kind of the middle class measuring rod that street families are not going to adhere to because they can't reach up to it. It's a very good text if you're interested in reading about this. It's not even a textbook. It's more of a story. It kind of reads like a novel. It's very interesting. But yeah, moving on. So conflict theory basically suggests that crime is caused or influenced by the actions and decisions of those with power. So it kind of it stems off of subcultural theories, but it's based on power. It's the dominant culture when it comes to race, socioeconomic status, etc. runs the country. And it also forces others into their norms. So we'll use the example like I was just talking about of Anderson's Code of the Street. Street families are not trying to allow the cultures of these dominant cultures of the white people, the rich people, etc. They're not going to adhere to those norms, but the decent families, the ones that are trying to make a legitimate life for themselves, they're going to try and adhere to those norms. That's kind of what conflict theory is looking at, basically in a nutshell. So social strain theory. So this is traced back to Emil Durkheim. He's kind of looked at as the father of sociology. You're going to see his name very, very often. So he described the concept of anomie. So anomie is kind of referred to the presence of normlessness or confusion. Martin's social strain theory is kind of the main social strain theory. He argued that our capitalist society shapes certain goals for members of our society while also socializing us about the acceptable strategies to attain those goals. So essentially, we all have the same goals. Everybody wants to be rich in America. That's we're going to talk a little bit more about it in another slide, but that's kind of what everybody wants. Everybody wants to be rich somehow, some way. But we don't have the same ways of achieving being rich, right? So we'll talk about how I was just talking about how, little Jimmy has the dad who's the CEO of the Fortune 500 company. He has a legitimate way of achieving those dreams because daddy's probably going to go. He's going to be at the best high school. He's going to pay for college, and he's going to go get a degree and get the internship at the best Fortune 500 company ever because his dad works there. So he has the legitimate ways to do that. However, on the flip hand side, those are the people that experience strain, the ones that don't have those opportunity structures, and the ones that strain is essentially placed on their lives. That's where the term strain comes from. So they have these different sorts of societal strain, of social strain placed upon them. People get frustrated. And when they're frustrated, they resort to the only way that they know how to make money and make a way of making a living, and that is crime of one way or another. So social strain theory was also kind of applied to Messner and Rosenfeld's institutional anomie theory. This is kind of the four values promoted in American society that promote crime. So we socialize to want more. That is the the American dream. We always want more. We always want more. The idea of universalism, everyone wants material success, even though not everyone can get rich. So although we always want more, there's only a certain amount of money out there. If you want to go and look at it, some people think they're rich until they go look at how much money Jeff Bezos and, Donald Trump, for lack of a better example, and Bill Gates and all these other, Fortune 500 CEOs and everybody else has. And it makes them feel pretty insignificant, actually, when you realize how much money the top 1% has. So we have individualism as well. We should be able to attain our financial goals on our own. We don't need help. Okay. And the materialism is that, material wealth is key. It is absolutely key. There's nobody in our generation essentially saying that, oh, I can live on $60,000. Even though you probably can, you can probably live a decent life on $60,000. We want $100,000 because we want the nicest cars and the nicest house and everything else. So that's kind of the basis of institutional enemy theory. So crime is a psychological factor, a social psychological factor rather. So life course theory, general strain theory, social control theory, and self-control theory are the main theories that we're going to talk about when it comes to social psychological factors. So life course theory, basically it's an interdisciplinary developmental theory, explains human behavior by examining how past events, including turning points, put individuals on certain trajectories for future behavior. Sampson and Laub are the two main proponents and the advocates of life course theory. They basically said like social bonds, for example, marriage, employment. So being married, having a job, having kids, they're turning points that may lead to some offenders to desist from crime. If you want to go look up the age crime curve and life course theory, that's kind of a good way to look at life course theory. Basically what happens is the majority of crime is committed, and in terms of the life course, basically saying the lifespan, a lot of people, they're committing crimes between the ages of like 16 and 24. Like I said, it's a developmental theory based on biology as well. If you think about it, and if you look at biological research and neurobiological research, you're going to see that males, especially because males are the ones that commit a high majority of crimes in a lot of areas, in a lot of contexts, that's when the age of 24, when people start to desist from crime, or criminals desist from crime, that's when males are finally fully developed in the brain, right? That's when our heads are finally set on straight. So this happens a lot earlier for females. That's why females don't commit a lot more crime. They don't commit a lot more adult crime. You see a lot higher percentages of females in the juvenile justice system because everybody really isn't mature at that point in time. But basically, by the time everybody's becoming an adult, males aren't really mature enough yet, but females are. So they know that they can't commit crimes anymore, but males we're just hard-headed. There's no other way to put it, right? It also kind of separates two different offenders. So we have, on one hand, we have adolescent limited offenders. So if you think of your adolescents, this is basically getting at that 15 to 24 range, and then a large majority of offenders desist from crime. On the other hand, we have life course persistent offenders. Those are the people that are still committing crime in their 30s and 40s and 50s. That kind of comes from life course theory, and that's also very important to know when it comes to life course theory. If you're looking more into life course theory, for just as a small tidbit, Dr. Metcalf is in the criminology department at USC. She does a lot of research with life course theory. If you want to learn more about it, she actually teaches a class on it. You can take that as an elective eventually. So general strain theory. This is Agnew expanded Merton's theory and pointed out that there are three sources of strain. Essentially, this is kind of how he differentiated strain theory from Merton. He identified these three main categories of strain. So we have either the failure to achieve positively valued goals, right? So I have a goal of I want to get a job and I want to buy a nice car, okay? So when I fail to do that, that presents a strain for me. Okay, so you have a removal or unexpected removal of positively valued stimuli. This is the best example of this is, say I have my mom is my role model, and she is the stimuli that keeps me going. Like right now I'm getting a PhD. My mom's the one that gives me, all the motivation in the world to get my PhD. She's always checking in on me, always asking to help, this, that, or next. And say, for example, she passed away, God forbid, that would be an example of removal or expected removal of positively valued stimuli. So obviously that's going to create a strain in my life. On the other hand, you can look at it kind of on the flip side of the exposure to and anticipated exposure to negative stimuli. Okay, so negative stimuli are things like punishments, for example, or failure to, or let's think about this. Basically, one of the best ways is, say, if you have like I call them leeches. Leeches are like bad friends that you say you've always been friends with, but they actually never help you in some sort of way, and they always sort of bring you down. That would be a negative stimuli, for example. So social control theory basically begins with the question of why people don't commit crime. So Travis Hershey is famous for looking at it the flip side, not looking at why do criminals commit crime. Let's look at why do most people not commit crime. So according to Hershey, most individuals do not commit crime because they have strong bonds to society. So they have the four elements of a strong bond, which is important to know, are the attachment, belief, involvement, and commitment. So self-control theory. So you'll see Hershey's name again. He also went to self-control theory, kind of partnered up with Michael Gottfredson. Both of these gentlemen are very active in research today. They're still professors in the United States. So according to these two, those with low self-control are more likely to act impulsive, be insensitive, be more physical, take more risks, be short-sighted, and nonverbal. Basically, when it comes to fighting or realizing what's going on, they're more willing to fight. They're more willing to be physical. They're not worried about long-term effects. They're only looking at, that's what short-sighted means. They want results now, and they're only worried about the next 20 minutes, not about the next 20 years. So they are the ones that are more likely to commit crimes. So, and then they also get it. One of the strengths of this theory is that it is relatively easy to assess. It's very easy to look at and do a kind of a personality inventory and a certain different society or demographic and see who commits more crime or not. So crime is a product of cognitive processes. Basic theory of these premise of these theories is that crime is produced, at least in part, by how we think, what we learn, or how we react in a way that others see us. So neutralization theory we're talking about too, learning theories, and labeling theory. So Sykes and Macha developed neutralization theory. Juveniles tend to know right from wrong, but they engage in delinquent acts after rationalizing or neutralizing their behavior as appropriate in specific situation. In order to put this in a better context, it's probably better to look at the 5 different types of neutralization. So denial of injury is, oh, I stole $5 from that person, but he's that CEO of a Fortune 500 company. It didn't really hurt him. It's not a big deal, right? Denial of a victim. Denial of responsibility, basically saying, I didn't do it. Condemnation of the condemners is saying, yeah, I stole from him, but he steals from everybody else. Everybody else steals from everybody else. So I'm not really that big, it's not really that big of a deal. There's bigger fish in the sea. And then appeal to higher loyalties is basically saying God let me do it, or God made me do it, or I did it for God, or I did it for the greater good, that kind of thing. Learning theories. So learning theory suggests that criminal behavior is learned, just to say same way that other behaviors are learned. There is a lot of good research when it comes to learning theory. Basically, we have learned, this is a little bit confusing, but we have learned how we learn things a long time ago. So this is something that, learning theory is in psychology, it's in education research, it's in everything. Basically, Sutherland outlined this theory in 9 different propositions. If you want to go look at those in the textbook, you can. I'm not going to make you look at those, but Sutherland and Akers are the 2 main proponents of learning theory. Akers kind of refined it and looked at it more in a psychological context and applied learning theory to criminal justice. So we have differential association and reinforcement theory. So we have differential association. We create definitions based on that association. There's also differential reinforcement based on how or why we are punished when it comes to acting out in a criminal context. And then we have imitation. So we imitate other criminal actions based on what we see, is kind of how learning theory applies to crime. Labeling theory. Lemert is kind of the main proponent of labeling theory. It calls attention to the way that labeling individuals contributes to future offending. Lemert discusses two different types of deviance. So you have primary deviance and you have secondary deviance. The best way to learn what labeling theory is and the main context of it is to think of it in like temporal order and or in chronological order. So you would have primary deviance. So say I, had no record, this, that, and next, and primary deviance, for some reason or another, I went and, stole $100 from a cash register in a gas station and I got caught, right? So we have two different ways to look at this. We can have me pay reparations, or they can send me to prison and label me as a criminal. So labeling theory is kind of that labeling process of labeling me as a criminal. And guess what? When I get out of crime, especially in America, when I get out of prison, especially in America, when it's hard for criminals to get jobs and for them to create legitimate opportunities for themselves, I'm forced to commit what Lemert referred to as secondary deviance. So the deviance that happens after the label has been put on a criminal. Labeling theory is a big aspect of why we create or why we have created a different juvenile justice system. The main ways to go about that is to not label juveniles as criminals early on, so that they kind of have the chance to develop a good life. And like I said earlier, a lot of the times it's males that aren't even mature enough yet to realize the implications of what they've done. So let's not label them as criminal. Let's try to deal with it. Let's provide them with routes to have a better life instead of just sending them to prison, and allowing them to not commit that secondary deviance, to kind of learn their lesson, realize they did wrong, and move on from it. Explaining juvenile delinquency, kind of many of the original criminological studies testing theories were studies of juvenile delinquency. Labeling theory had a big thing from juveniles. Social disorganization was also studied from juveniles, for example. So when considering labeling theory and social construction, the very decision about whether to label behaviors as criminal, delinquent, or both is socially constructed. The application of criminological theories vary between adults and juveniles as well. It's also very important to know. So crime policies or practices or strategies developed or designed to prevent or respond to crime. So specific programs like Weed and Seed, if you want to look that up, that's a very good program that was developed. Juvenile work program, stuff like that. That's another example of criminal justice policies. We also have social support policies, like instead of sending somebody to prison for stealing, here comes the philosophical question of, if somebody steals bread to feed their family, what do we do with them? Social support policies are, for example, are like giving them job training so that they can go and get a legitimate job so that they can provide for their family. That's one way to do it. And then reintegrative shaming, that's something that we do a lot in the juvenile justice system, some in the adult criminal justice system as well in modern times. But reintegrative shaming is kind of the principle of, we're going to shame them into realizing that they did wrong. Not in like a terrible context, but we're going to have them acknowledge what they did was wrong, how to fix it, how to pay reparations to the victim of any sort. And we're going to kind of get them back into reintegrate. That's why the reintegrative part is in that phrase. We're going to reintegrate them back into society so that they can become a fully functioning member of society again. So in conclusion, these are kind of some of the main topics. Make sure that you study the learning objectives at the beginning of this presentation. If you have any questions, please post them to those open discussion forum. I think the theory is very important. Please make sure that you give it the importance that you need. I would pay attention to the main proponents of these theories, as well as trying to identify the people who have proposed them. If the names were on this PowerPoint, I would recommend getting to know these names, because they're very important in criminological theory. They're very important in criminal justice through and through, because a lot of good policies and practices in the criminal justice system are developed from sound theories. So they're very important to know.